The wind doesn't just blow through the Blackwood Pines, it breathes. If you've ever been deep enough into the Oregon wilderness, past the cell towers, past the marked logging trails, past the point where the radio stations dissolve into static, you know the kind of silence I'm talking about. It's not peaceful, it's heavy, like the air right before a severe thunderstorm, pressing down on your chest until every breath feels earned. We were 4 of us. Miller, who'd been my best friend since we were pulling the tabs off soda cans in middle school. His girlfriend, Clara, a sharp-witted grad student who didn't scare easily. Sarah, a quiet photographer who always looked at the world through a lens as if to keep it at arm's length. And me, Logan. We had been planning this trip for 6 months. We wanted isolation, and we got it. We parked Miller's truck at a dead-end fire road and hiked 6 miles into a valley the locals called the Devil's Wash Basin. It was a bowl-shaped depression surrounded by ancient towering Douglas firs that blotted out the sun, leaving the forest floor in a perpetual damp twilight. By 8 p.m., the twilight bled into a suffocating blackness. The temperature dropped fast, the mountain air turning sharp and biting. We built a fire, not a small polite campfire, but a roaring, snapping beast of oak and pine logs we had gathered. It was our only shield against the dark. Jesus, it's like a tomb out here, Miller muttered, tossing another branch onto the flames. Sparks flew upward, dying instantly in the cold air. "That's the point, babe," Clara said, pulling her wool blanket tighter around her shoulders. "And whatever is watching us," Sarah said softly. She was sitting slightly back from the heat, her hands wrapped around a metal mug of black coffee. She wasn't looking at us. She was looking past my shoulder into the wall of trees. "Don't start," I laughed, though my voice sounded thin, swallowed instantly by the vastness of the woods. "You're going to set Miller off, and he's the one who brought the hatchet." "Hey, I'm a lover, not a fighter," Miller grinned, poking the coals with a long stick. "But speaking of which, we need entertainment. No phones, no service. It's prime time. Who's got a story?" That's how it started. A stupid tradition. We'd done it on every camping trip since college, trying to out-creep each other. But tonight, the atmosphere felt different. The firelight danced violently against the massive trunks of the trees, creating long, shifting shadows that looked like limbs stretching towards us. The air smelled thick with the scent of damp earth, decaying pine needles, and the sharp, metallic tang of ozone. "I'll go first," Miller said, leaning forward. The firelight illuminated the sharp angles of his face, casting deep shadows beneath his eyes. "I've got a good one, real old school." We all settled in. I took a sip of my whiskey, letting the burn settle in my throat, trying to ignore the way the forest seemed to grow entirely silent, as if the birds and insects were leaning in to listen too.
"So, there's this guy," Miller began, his voice dropping an octave, adopting that classic, rhythmic cadence of a campfire storyteller. Let's call him David. David is a surveyor for the Forestry Service back in the late 90s. His job is to go out into the deep backcountry, completely alone, and map out sectors that haven't been touched in a century. He's got a tiny one-room cabin out in the middle of nowhere. No electricity, just a gas generator and an old ham radio for emergencies. Now David is used to the isolation. He likes it. But about 2 weeks into his stint, the weather turns foul. A massive front rolls in, heavy, freezing rain that turns the ground into liquid mud and makes it impossible to work. He's trapped inside. The first night of the storm, the radio starts acting up. It's supposed to be turned off, but around midnight, it just clicks on. It doesn't broadcast a voice, it just emits this heavy, wet, white noise, like static, but deeper, like the sound of water rushing through an underground pipe. David gets up, turns the knob to off, and goes back to sleep. An hour later, it clicks on again, louder this time. He walks over, pulls the power cord right out of the wall, and goes back to bed. 10 minutes pass. Click. The static fills the room again. David is sitting up in bed now, his heart hammering. The radio is unplugged. The screen is dead, but the speaker is vibrating. And then, beneath the white noise, he starts to hear something else. A wet, tearing sound, like someone pulling wet Velcro apart, or like someone pulling a heavy weight through thick, deep mud. It's rhythmic. Schlump, schlump, schlump. It sounds like it's coming from the radio, but then he realizes it's not. The sound is coming from outside, right under his window. David gets his flashlight. He approaches the glass, his breath fogging the pane. He wipes it away, shines the beam out into the pouring rain. There's nothing but mud and trees, but the sound is right there. Schlump, schlump. He thinks it's an animal, maybe a bear caught in the mud. He opens the cabin door, holding his rifle, intending to scare it off. The moment the door swings open, the static from the unplugged radio gets deafeningly loud. He takes one step onto the porch. The mud is thick, pulling at his boots. He shines the light down at his feet. And that's when he sees it. It isn't an animal. The mud itself is moving. It's rising up, thick and black, defying gravity. Before he can scream, his foot sinks deep into the earth, not like stepping into a puddle, but like something grabbed his ankle from beneath. He falls backward onto the porch. The mud surges up over the floorboards. It pours into his mouth, his nose, his eyes. It's heavy, weighing hundreds of pounds, filling his lungs. The last thing he hears before he suffocates is the radio turning into a clear, crisp human voice, whispering his own name over and over into the dark. Miller blew out a breath, throwing his hands up. Boom! Mud monster. Classic. Ugh, that's disgusting, Miller. Clara laughed, shoving his shoulder. The wet Velcro sound? Seriously? I'm trying to drink my cider. Hey, graphic detail is the hallmark of great literature, Miller said, taking a swig of his beer. I smiled, but my eyes drifted back to the perimeter of our camp. The wind had picked up, a low, steady moan that rattled the upper canopy of the pines. It was good, man, but you ruined it with a magic radio. Keep it grounded. Whatever, skeptic, Miller joked. He stood up, stretching his long legs. That beer went right through me. I'm gonna go pee. Don't start the next story without me. Don't go too far, Sarah. The brush gets really thick near the ridge. I'll be 30 feet away, Sarah. If a bear eats me, I'll make sure to scream in a grounded, realistic way for Logan, he called back over his shoulder. We watched the beam of his flashlight cut through the dark as he walked past the perimeter of the tents, heading towards a large cluster of ferns near the base of a massive, decaying stump. The light bounced around for a moment, then settled on the ground as he put it down to do his business. We sat in silence for a minute. The fire cracked loudly, a pocket of sap exploding with a sharp crack. "He's taking a while," Clara said, her voice dropping the playful tone she had a moment ago. She checked her watch. It had been about 3 minutes. "He's probably just trying to freak us out," I said, though a small knot of unease formed in my stomach. "Miller, hurry up, it's freezing." No answer. "Miller!" Clara called out, standing up. Nothing. Just the wind in the trees. Hold on, I said, grabbing my own flashlight. I'll get him. I stepped out of the warmth of the fire ring. The cold hit me instantly, biting at my face. The earth beneath my boots felt strangely soft, almost spongy. I walked towards the spot where his flashlight beam was still glowing on the ground. "Miller, stop being a dick, man. Clara's getting mad," I said, my voice louder now. I reached the stump. His flashlight was lying face up in the dirt, illuminating the low leaves of a fern. Miller wasn't standing there. I picked up his flashlight and shone it around. The beam cut through the dark, hitting the thick trunks of the fir trees. Miller? Then I heard it. It was a low, wet sound. Schlump, schlump. My blood ran entirely cold. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I slowly turned the flashlight down, pointing it at the ground right in front of the stump. There was a deep, jagged depression in the earth. It wasn't a sinkhole. It looked like the ground had simply opened up and swallowed a section of the forest floor. And there, barely visible beneath a thick, churning layer of black, liquid mud, was the sleeve of Miller's red flannel shirt. "Miller!" I screamed, dropping to my knees. I drove my hands into the mud. It was freezing cold, thick as wet cement, and it felt horribly heavy. I clawed at it, tearing my nails against roots, trying to find his arm, his shoulder, anything. The mud seemed to fight back, pulling at my wrists, sucking my hands down with a terrifying rhythmic pressure. "Logan, what's happening?" Clara's voice shrieked from behind me. She and Sarah were running towards me, their flashlights bouncing wildly. "Help me! He's under the dirt!" I yelled, my voice cracking into a panicked sob. They dropped beside me, digging frantically into the earth. But it was useless. The mud was too thick, too deep. Every handful we threw out seemed to instantly refill from some subterranean source. As we dug, a horrible, wet, tearing sound echoed from beneath the earth, like wet Velcro being pulled apart. We dug until our fingers were bleeding, until our muscles burned, but there was nothing. Miller was gone. The ground beneath us slowly settled, becoming solid and still once more, leaving only a patch of dark, wet earth that smelled intensely of old decay and copper.
We scrambled back to the fire ring, screaming, crying, stumbling over our own feet. Clara was hyperventilating, her hands covered in dark filth, tears carving clean lines through the dirt on her face. "This isn't real. This isn't happening. Oh my God. Oh my God," she chanted, rocking back and forth by the fire. "We need to go. We need to leave right now," Sarah whispered. Her face was deathly pale, her eyes wide and bloodshot. She was clutching her camera bag to her chest like a shield. "The truck is 6 miles away," I said, my hands shaking so violently I could barely hold my flashlight. "It's pitch black. We don't even have the trail marked clearly enough to hike it in the dark without getting lost. We'll freeze, or worse. We can't stay here," Clara screamed, her voice echoing off the trees. "Did you hear it? Did you see it? It was exactly like his story." "It was a sinkhole," I lied, trying desperately to ground myself, to find a rational explanation because the alternative meant losing my mind. "It was a subterranean pocket. The rain last week must have destabilized the upper crust. It was a freak accident, Clara." "A sinkhole that made that sound?" Sarah hissed, her voice trembling. "Logan, look at the fire. Look at the camp. Tell me this feels like a normal accident." I looked. The forest seemed to have closed in around us. The darkness felt thick, almost physical, pressing against the meager light of our campfire. And then I noticed something that made my breath hitch.
The fire was dying, not because we hadn't added wood, but because the air felt heavy, devoid of the oxygen needed to keep it thriving. The flames were a dull, sickly orange, barely casting any light beyond our immediate circle. "We stay together," I said, my voice dead and flat. "We sit right here. We don't move. We don't go to the bathroom. We don't look into the woods. In 4 hours, the sun comes up and we run for the truck. Do you understand me?" Clara nodded blankly, staring into the dying coals. Sarah pulled her knees to her chest, her knuckles white. We sat there for what felt like an eternity. The silence of the forest was absolute now. No wind, no rustling leaves, just the sound of our own ragged breathing. The paranoia was a physical weight, a wire wrapping tighter and tighter around our necks. Every shadow looked like a figure. Every crack of a cooling coal sounded like a footstep. "I need to talk," Sarah whispered after an hour of silence. Her voice was cracked. "Don't, Sarah," I warned, a deep instinctive dread rising in my chest. "No, I have to," she insisted, her eyes fixed on the fire. "I have to think about something else. I'll tell a story, a real one, something that happened to my uncle in Montana. It's just a story, Logan. It's just a way to pass the time." "Sarah, please," Clara begged, but Sarah was already starting. Her voice hollow and rhythmic, falling into that same trance-like cadence Miller had used.
"My uncle was a winter photographer," Sarah said, her voice steady but devoid of life. "He went into the backcountry of Montana in January to shoot the ice formations on the cliffs. He was supposed to be gone for 3 days. On the second day, a blizzard hit. Total whiteout. The temperature dropped to 40 below zero within an hour. He managed to pitch his 4-season tent, but the wind tore the poles right out of the fabric. He was left with nothing but his gear and his clothes. He knew if he stayed still, he'd die. So he started walking through the blinding snow, looking for any kind of shelter, a cave, an overhanging rock, anything. As he walked, the cold started doing things to his head. You know how hypothermia works. First you freeze, then you feel warm. Then you start to hallucinate. He started seeing things in the whiteout, figures standing just outside his field of vision. He thought they were search parties, so he'd run towards them, but every time he got close, it was just a dead tree trunk or a pile of snow. But the figures kept appearing, and they were getting closer. He could hear them. Not voices, but a sound, a rhythmic metallic click. 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 Every time he heard the sound, his body felt a little colder, his limbs a little heavier. He realized the sound wasn't in his head. It was coming from behind him. He turned around, raising his own camera, looking through the telephoto lens into the swirling white snow. He adjusted the focus. Through the lens, through the veil of ice, he saw someone standing 20 feet away. It was a man wrapped in a heavy winter coat, holding a camera up to his face, pointing it right back at him. My uncle took a picture. The flash went off. In that split second of light, he saw the man's face. It was him. It was a perfect frozen copy of himself, except its eyes were completely black and its skin was the color of bruised ice. The copy took a step forward. Click. My uncle felt his fingers freeze solid, turning black instantly. The copy took another step. Click. My uncle's legs gave out, the frostbite eating through his nerves. He fell into the snow, unable to move, unable to breathe. The copy walked up to him, stood directly over him, and tilted its camera down. The last thing my uncle saw was his own dead, frozen face reflected in the glass of the lens as the shutter clicked one final time. The moment Sarah finished the sentence, the temperature in our camp didn't just drop, it plummeted. It was instantaneous. 1 second the air was chilly, the next our breath exploded in thick white fumes. A sudden unnatural frost spread across the ground, turning the damp pine needles a glittering, brittle white. The logs in our campfire groaned as a layer of ice visibly crawled over the burning wood, choking the remaining embers until they died with a pathetic hiss. We were plunged into near total darkness. "Sarah!" I gasped, the air burning my throat like swallowed glass. My joints stiffened immediately, a terrifying deep tissue cold locking my knees. "I can't feel my hands," Clara whimpered. She was shivering violently, her teeth chattering so hard I thought they would shatter. I fumbled for my flashlight, my fingers numb and responsive. I managed to click it on. The beam was dim, the batteries dying from the sudden extreme cold. I shone it towards Sarah.
Sarah was sitting perfectly still. She wasn't shivering. She was looking down at her lap, where her heavy DSLR camera sat. Her hands were gripping the casing. Her skin was already turning a dull, sickly shade of blue. "Sarah!" I lunged forward, but my legs were heavy, numb from the waist down. Click. The sound was incredibly loud in the frozen silence. It came from Sarah's camera. The digital screen on the back flared to life, casting a stark white glow up onto her face. Her eyes were wide, staring blankly ahead. They were completely black. The pupils dilated so far that the whites of her eyes were entirely gone. Frost was forming on her eyelashes, her eyebrows, the corners of her mouth. Click. The camera shutter fired again on its own. "Sarah, look at me! Get up!" I screamed, reaching out and grabbing her shoulder. She was solid, hard as stone. Her jacket was stiff with ice. When I pulled her, she didn't budge. She felt like a statue carved from the mountain itself. Click. A third time, the shutter snapped. On the small LCD screen on the back of the camera, a preview of the photo popped up. It was a shot of our camp, taken from the perspective of the dark woods behind Sarah. In the foreground of the photo, sitting right at the edge of the light, was the back of Sarah's head, and standing right behind her, its hands hovering just inches above her shoulders, was a tall, emaciated shape. It had no face, just a smooth, pale expanse of skin, but it was holding a camera. The screen blinked out. Sarah's head tilted back, a sharp, brittle snap echoing from her neck as her spine froze solid. She was gone. Clara didn't scream this time. She couldn't. The terror had progressed past the point of vocalization, turning into a silent, mad panic. She grabbed my arm with a grip so tight I felt her fingernails pierce my jacket. "The truck!" she whispered, her breath freezing into ice crystals in the air. "Logan, the truck! Now! I don't care if we get lost. I don't care if we die in the dark. We have to run." I didn't argue. I couldn't look at Sarah's frozen, black-eyed stare anymore. I grabbed Clara by the waist, helping her stand on her numb legs, and we began to stumble away from the dead fire, away from the tents, back towards the direction of the ridge. The forest had become an active enemy. The frost made the steep incline incredibly slick. Every step was a gamble.
We fell repeatedly, tearing our hands on frozen rocks and sharp, icy twigs. The air felt like inhaling needles, our lungs burning with every agonizing breath. Behind us, through the dark, we could hear it. It wasn't a footstep. It was a combination of sounds. Slump, click, slump, click. The earth was churning behind us, and the air was snapping with the sound of a phantom camera shutter. It was gaining on us, moving with a horrific, steady rhythm through the pitch black. "Fast, Clara, faster!" I yelled, pulling her up a steep embankment. We scrambled over the top of the ridge, crashing through a dense thicket of briars, and found ourselves in a small clearing that we hadn't seen on the hike in. In the center of the clearing stood a dilapidated, collapsing wooden structure, an old ranger outpost or a poacher's cabin from decades ago, its roof long since caved in by winter snows. "In there," I panted, desperation taking over.
We sprinted across the clearing and threw ourselves through the broken doorway of the cabin. The interior was small, smelling of dry rot and old iron. I slammed the heavy oak door shut and slid a rusted iron bolt into place. It wasn't much, but it was a barrier. We collapsed against the wall, gasping for air. My hands were completely numb, the skin a pale, waxy white. Clara was hyperventilating, her eyes darting around the ruined cabin. "We're going to die here. We're going to die like them." "No, we're not," I said, though I didn't believe a word of it. I shone my dying flashlight around the room, looking for anything we could use as a weapon or a tool. The beam hit a wall covered in old, yellowed papers, maps, forestry logs, and newspaper clippings from the 1970s tacked to the rotting wood. I dragged myself closer, my eyes scanning the text out of some desperate need to distract my brain from the pounding at the back of my head. One clipping caught my eye. The headline was faded but legible. 3 hikers missing in Devil's Wash Basin. Search called off. I leaned in closer, my breath fogging the wall. ... Local authorities have suspended the search for the missing members of the Vance party. Local tribal legends refer to the valley as the Echoing Woods, a place where an ancient entity known colloquially as the Listener resides. According to folklore, the entity has no form of its own, but feeds on the fears and imaginations of those who enter its domain. It manifests the stories told within the perimeter, binding the storytellers to the fates they create for entertainment. Elders warn never to speak of death or monsters within the valley, as the woods take every word as an invitation. My heart stopped. The woods take every word as an invitation. Miller had told a story about mud and suffocation. He died in the mud. Sarah had told a story about freezing and cameras. She froze to death, her camera firing on its own. "Logan." Clara's voice was completely different now. It wasn't panicked anymore. It was quiet, hollow. I slowly turned around. Clara was sitting in the corner of the cabin, her hands resting limply on her knees. She was staring at the floorboards. "Clara?" I whispered, a new, deeper terror gripping my chest. "Clara, look at me." "It's my turn," she said softly. "No, no, Clara, don't say anything. Don't tell a story. Shut up, just shut up," I screamed, lunging across the room to put my hands over her mouth. But she didn't move away. She didn't struggle. She just looked up at me, and her eyes were completely blank, her pupils starting to expand, swallowing the green of her irises. "I have to tell it," Clara whispered against my hand, her voice carrying an unnatural, resonant strength that didn't belong to her. "It's already in my head. If I don't say it, it'll just happen anyway." I pulled my hand back, horrified. "There was a girl," Clara said, her voice dropping into that rhythmic campfire cadence. "She was trapped in a room with someone she thought she knew, but the room wasn't safe. There was something else in there with them, something hiding in the dark corners where the light couldn't reach.
The girl tried to stay quiet, but the entity was hungry. It didn't want to just kill her. It wanted her to do it herself. It whispered to her, using the voice of her friends, telling her that the only way to escape the pain, the only way to escape the cold, was to use the sharp edge. She had a knife in her pocket, a small silver folding knife her father gave her. She took it out. Her hands were so cold she could barely open the blade, but she managed. She pressed the blade to her skin. The metal was cold, but the blood was so warm. It felt like the only warm thing left in the world. She dragged the blade across, once, twice, deep into the flesh, until the floor was covered in red, and the cold didn't matter anymore. "Clara, stop!" I yelled, grabbing her shoulders and shaking her violently. "Stop it! Look at me! You don't have a knife! You don't have one!"
Clara smiled. It was a terrible, empty smile that stretched her lips until they cracked and bled. Slowly, deliberately, she reached into her jacket pocket. She pulled out Miller's folding hunting knife, the one he'd used to cut the paracord earlier that afternoon. She must have picked it up from the camp table before we ran. I screamed, "Clara, drop it! Drop it!" I screamed, trying to pry her fingers away from the handle, but her grip was like iron. Her numb, frost-bitten fingers locked around the casing. With a horrific, smooth motion, she snapped the blade open. I grabbed her wrist, putting all my weight into pinning her hand to the floor. I was sobbing, begging her, screaming at the walls, cursing whatever entity was doing this to us. Sobbing, "Please, take me instead. Leave her alone. Let her go." Clara's eyes were entirely black now. She didn't look at me. She looked past me, toward the dark corner of the cabin behind my shoulder. Whispering, "It's already here, Logan," she whispered. With an unnatural sudden burst of strength, she wrenched her arm free from my grip. Before I could catch her, she brought the blade down, pressing it deep into the flesh of her left wrist. "No!" I screamed. She didn't flinch. She didn't scream. She just dragged the knife across, a deep, jagged line, and then did the same to her other arm. The blood poured out, thick and dark, splattering against the dusty woodboard floors. It was steaming in the freezing air, the only warm thing left in the room. She collapsed backward against the wall, her chest heaving a few times, her eyes staring blankly at the ceiling until the life faded from them completely, leaving her still and silent in the pooling crimson. I was alone. I sat in the center of the cabin, surrounded by the blood of my friends, the freezing air hardening the crimson puddles into a brittle, dark ice. My breath came in short, ragged gasps. My mind was completely broken, fractured into 1,000 pieces of pure, unadulterated terror. I knew how this worked now. It was my turn. If I didn't tell a story, I'd just sit here until the cold took me. If I did tell a story, I'd die exactly how I described it. There was no escape. The entity had won the moment we pitched our tents in the valley. I reached out, my trembling hand touching Clara's cold, dead face. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I'm so sorry." I stood up, my legs stiff, and walked to the broken door of the cabin. I unbolted it and pushed it open. The forest was completely still. The frost had turned everything into a silver, dead landscape. The moon was high now, casting a pale, ghostly light over the clearing. The rhythmic sounds had stopped. The entity was waiting. It was waiting for its finale. I walked out into the center of the clearing, my flashlight dropping from my useless, frozen fingers, the battery finally dying completely. I stood under the moonlight, looking toward the tree line. "You want a story?" I screamed into the empty woods, my voice cracking, tears freezing on my cheeks. "You want one last story?" The forest didn't answer, but the air seemed to thicken, a heavy, suffocating pressure settling over the clearing. "Fine," I yelled. "I'll give you one. There was a guy named Logan. He went into the woods with his friends. They all died, and he was left completely alone. He ran into an old cabin, and he realized there was no way out. So he just stood there, and he waited for the monster to tear him apart. He didn't fight. He just let it happen." I stopped, panting, closing my eyes, waiting for the claws, waiting for the mud, waiting for the blade, waiting for whatever horrific manifestation the woods would create to end my life. Seconds passed.
The wind didn't blow. The ground didn't move. The temperature didn't drop any further. I slowly opened my eyes. The clearing was empty. The forest was silent. A deep, sickening realization began to worm its way into my brain. The text on the wall, bound to the fates they create for entertainment. I hadn't told a scary story. I had just recounted what happened. It wasn't creative. It wasn't a tale told around a fire. The entity didn't want reality. It wanted the game. It wanted the fiction. And then a thought hit me that made my throat tighten until I couldn't breathe. Miller's story. He had introduced it by saying, "Who's got a story? I'll go first." Sarah had said, "I'll tell a story, a real one." Clara had said, "It's my turn." We had 4 friends on this trip: Miller, Sarah, Clara, and me. But as I stood there in the icy moonlight, my mind forced its way back through the memories of the night, back to the fire ring before everything fell apart. I remembered the way we were sitting. I had been sitting next to Clara. Clara was next to Miller. Miller was next to Sarah. And Sarah was sitting next to a 5th shadow. My mind had filtered it out. The terror, the darkness, the smoke from the fire. Our brains are hardwired to protect us from things that don't make sense, to blend them into the background. But looking back at the memory now, with absolute horrific clarity, I saw it. There had been 5 of us sitting around that fire ring all night. A tall, thin figure, wrapped in a dark, tattered coat, its face hidden beneath a deep hood, sitting perfectly still on a log between Sarah and me. It hadn't spoken. It hadn't moved. It had just sat there, warming its non-existent hands by our fire, listening to us. And I remembered something else. Before Miller started his story, before any of us had said a word, a voice had spoken into the dark. It was a low, raspy whisper, so faint I assumed it was just the wind catching the dry pine needles. The voice had said, "Let's tell stories about how we die." It wasn't Miller who had started the game. It was the fifth person. And it hadn't told its story yet. As that realization crystallized in my mind, I heard a sound from inside the ruined cabin behind me. It wasn't the sound of mud. It wasn't the click of a camera. It wasn't the scrape of a blade. It was the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, heavy footsteps walking across the creaking floorboards, moving toward the open doorway. I couldn't move. My legs were locked in place by a terror so profound it transcended physical paralysis. I slowly turned my head to look back at the cabin. Emerging from the pitch-black interior, stepping over Clara's blood-soaked threshold into the pale moonlight, was the figure in the tattered coat. The hood was pulled low, but as it stepped into the light, the shadow shifted. There was no face underneath, just a hollow, rotting void filled with the faint, flickering embers of a dying campfire. It stopped 10 feet away from me. It raised a long, emaciated arm, its skin the color of old ash, and pointed a single, jagged finger directly at my chest. And then, using my own voice, perfectly mimicking my tone, my pitch, my inflection, it spoke into the freezing night air. "And the last one," the entity whispered, its chest expanding with a hollow, rattling breath. "The last one stayed alive just long enough to realize he was never meant to leave the woods."